If there is one thing that I've been requesting and talking about a lot, it's oversampling. But it turns out it's all not as simple as it seems. Recently, I received an email from Sam Fisherman, the programmer from Music Hack, asking me if I wanted to do an interview about oversampling with him. And I replied with yes, because I want to know more about oversampling. And the weird thing is that after you are understanding all of the things that we're talking about in this video, you'll notice that we have just scratched the surface about this. So let's get started with the interview. Can you give me a quick introduction of who you are and what you do?
I'm Sam Fishman. I'm the technical half of Music Hack. I'm the hack. So I program audio plugins. I didn't used to do that. I spent a long time just in the software industry, in kind of the embedded industry, which are the computers that are inside of things like phones and cars, the computers we don't think about, and web stuff. Because I'm, like many other musicians, somebody who went to school for and had a lot of passion for music, loved computer music, and then had no idea how to get money out of it. So became a programmer. And finally, during COVID, I decided it's time to stop doing that and start doing what you actually care about. And so I married the two interests once and for all, and I'm trying to make sure that I get to do that forever. Because like everybody knows, once you find what you want, it's like a whole other job to figure out how to make sure that that will sustain you. So that's where I'm at, and that's who I am.
So the reason for this call, I want to talk about a very specific thing in plugins, and that's called oversampling. In the last years, I've been constantly bitching about oversampling in my videos. Do you think it's fair to request oversampling in every plugin? Do you think it's always an improvement of quality? Definitely when we're talking about saturation and those type of plugins.
So yeah, when you're talking about saturation, I think that yes, usually it does matter. I think that there are some processes where aliasing is actually part of the sound. However, I think that, especially when we're talking about things like analog emulation and stuff like that, oversampling is a big part of the deal. Specifically, though, it's not oversampling itself, I think, that's important so much as aliasing reduction, right? Oversampling is the number one way that plugin developers have approached that, in the past and up until now, because it's a general solution to the problem. It doesn't matter what type of processing you're doing, and so it's generally a good idea. There's one note, which is that if whatever math the plugin developers have come up with does not alias, this would be, say, if all the processing is linear, which is a strict mathematical definition for what linear versus nonlinear processing is, then oversampling will not help you. And so it's the right move to either listen for or look at something to tell you whether or not that plugin is doing it.
How would you define a listen test for aliasing or a listen test for the fact that oversampling is actually needed?
Yeah, so to test for aliasing, if you're listening to actual material that you would listen to for real, then yeah, I think that's the main thing, is listening in the high end. And if you're doing some very extreme processing, it'll fold back further and further into lower frequencies. But unless the plugin is either really insane or really bad, that's where you're going to hear it. It's going to sound, something's going to be off sizzly in an unpleasant way, especially if you're doing a lot of stuff. You get these kind of high frequency buildups. And the reason for that is mathematically what happens is sort of frequencies start to bounce off of the Nyquist frequency. We might say bounce or fold back. That means at first, it's going to be so high that most people's ears won't be able to hear it. I'm not going to make any judgments on everybody, but most people, as we get older, we kind of lose the very top end. But then the worse the aliasing is, it starts to fold back until you get into like 14,000 hertz, 13,000 hertz, and then it starts to get really nasty. And so that's how you hear it. If you have a test signal, like a sine sweep, it's much easier if you want to just put one plugin on a track, throw a sine sweep through it, and then you'll be able to hear very clearly if there's aliasing, because your sine sweep should just go whoop, and as it starts to get really high, it should become silent to you once it leaves whatever your personal threshold for hearing is, and then once it gets to the top, it'll start from the bottom. If you have aliasing, you're going to hear it go whoop, weep, 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 weep. You'll hear these little sweeps underneath it. And so if you hear those sweeps, you know that plugin is aliasing, and that's actually a good way to do it not looking at a chart, because you can see, okay, maybe when I have my ear on and I have my chart on, this will help me see like, oh, about here in the chart is where it stops mattering. And this is different for if you're going to do a final master versus if you're doing lots of processing, because of course you'll get buildup if you're using a ton of plugins on a ton of different tracks. There's a lot of considerations.
It's interesting what you're saying here, because with aliasing, I mean, if it adds up over multiple channels, like for instance, if you have an analog simulating channel strip that is meant to be put on all your channels, and the channel strip is aliasing, I mean, that adds up to a lot of frequencies that aren't musically connected with the source material, like a lot of harmonics, basically, that shouldn't have no reason to be there.
That's right. And it just, depending on all the stuff you're doing, that can have different kinds of effects on the sound. So even though they are not, let's say, musically related, they're going to be mathematically related in some way. So if all of your tracks are different, it's not like all those frequencies are going to stack in the exact same places, because all your tracks are doing different things. So it's going to end up as sort of this harsh, high-frequency noise that some people will be more sensitive to than others, and it just starts becoming part of the whole process. I have not studied this, but part of my theory on that is that if you have lots of in-the-box processing, that'll start to build up over time. And that's one of the reasons why some plugins, I think, like, I don't know the names of all of them, but the most famous one is Soothe. We put a feature in this in our plugin and stuff like that. They start to build up these high frequencies, and they can kind of be smeared depending on where these things happen. Not to say it's the only way, but that's part of what causes that buildup, or can be.
One of the things I get as response from plugin developers to my request for oversampling is that they're saying, hey, the aliasing is not audible. Do you have, when you are developing, any scientific way of defining what is audible and what is not audible? Because for me, there are a lot of variables involved in figuring out what is audible and what is not.
I'm always careful with my words when I have the impression that I don't think someone will be able to hear something, because I think that it's just really tough. I think certain people are more or less sensitive to different things that happen in audio. And audio is kind of half magic, half science, right? I mean, there are the parts that we don't understand. You got a whole fields of psychoacoustics. I tend to be careful about saying things like that, and I'll say things like, this is outside of what humans are typically known to hear, or something like that, because I think that's a more fair statement to make. I do feel like there are times when something is so far below a threshold. And it's important to know that in audio, we're always dealing with thresholds, because when we filter something, we're not completely eliminating it. All we can do is tuck it further and further and further down in decibels. So at some point, we have to agree that it's quiet enough we can't hear, because we can't say it's disappeared completely. Mathematically, it just keeps getting quieter. And we know this because signal math isn't just for audio. Signal math is in sciences that are far, far different. I mean, you can use signal math to look at the tide, to look at signals coming from space. And so it's all about these tolerances. I'm just careful with that. I think as a developer, it's not necessarily fair to say it's inaudible unless you're measuring it below, like, I guess, the hearing threshold if you looked on a chart, which is best you can do. But in audio, we're stacking stuff all the time.
Exactly.
You know?
That's my point.
Yeah.
I mean, you can say it's inaudible on a single source. I actually just finished a side note, and the viewers will have already seen this. I just finished my review of the Herchild tube compressor. And I did a full mix using only that compressor. So on all kinds of different channels. And then a second mix where I matched up the settings in the UAD Fairchild plugin. And if you compare the individual channels with each other, differences aren't really you know, it's really close. If you compare the full mix, it's a huge difference. So again, like the problem with audio is things stack up, and this is also the whole argument with audio quality, sample rates, all that kind of stuff. Like, yes, on a single source, and you know, delivery. So for a consumer, 44.1 is enough. Unless you're not agreeing with it. But 44.1 mathematically, 16 bits should be enough. But in audio, we're doing more than just the stereo processing thing. And that's I think where where some people in the industry are getting it wrong. I don't want to name brands or something, but I've had some very fierce discussions like, hey, define what is inaudible for me and also define what is inaudible in complex mixing situations, because I don't think the curve of complexity is linear when you start mixing. I think when you're doing a mix of 24 tracks, it's exponentially more complex in figuring out if artifacts will stay inaudible.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And I do think that there are some situations where that builds up just as high frequency noise because they're all different tracks doing different things. There are some situations where a simple high shelf or low pass filter that's set really high can help with that situation, but that's not always going to be the case. And one thing I want to add to the 24, like stacking the tracks thing and oversampling and stuff is certain characteristics of what goes on affect what happens down the chain. And as mixers are using more and masters are using more and more complex products that do these calculations with super high frequencies trying to soothe the sound or react to true peaks, those calculations are going to be affected by what's going on in frequencies we can't hear sometimes. So it's not just the noise, it's like our chain becomes harder to work with if there's unpredictable stuff going on, even in frequencies we can't hear.
So what you're saying is there could be inaudible stuff that can become a problem later down the line.
I think so, yes.
So about oversampling, because I think, oversampling is the most used, as you're just saying, the best way of doing aliasing reduction. What are the downsides of oversampling? What are the issues that you're running into when you're trying to program oversampling for plugins?
Okay, so this is one of those, you've got three things you want, pick two, right?
Okay,
So
okay.
You have latency, that's one. In certain applications, latency matters. In certain applications, it's less important. You have the processing power that it takes, and you have the quality, right? And when you create something that's in this realm, oversampling, there's lots of steps that are involved. You have to make lots of decisions. And each time you make a decision, you're going to be balancing between these three factors. And you're going to try to make the best decisions. Create whatever final oversampling solution is going to best fit the product that you're making. If you need to oversample on something that's going to be used for tracking, you don't have a choice. You have to make sure that it works well for latency, right? Because if it doesn't, some people simply cannot or won't use it. And so then that means you're going to have to make sacrifices in one of the other two. If you want to make the highest quality thing possible, oftentimes you're able to make decisions that maximize the quality and processing power. Quality hounds like you and like me, we're going to want to make sure that, hey, I'll give up latency, and if I can't give up latency, I'll just make it super hard on the CPU. Those are the decisions where I'll take the hit because I cannot take the hit for quality. But it goes deeper than that. So latency is one of the major drawbacks that oversampling will add if it's on the way in. So this matters a lot, say, for synthesizers or things you would play live. You could always turn off oversampling, then turn it on after you've tracked. There's solutions for that. The other thing is that when you're oversampling, there's different techniques to oversample, and they'll have different effects on the signal. The biggest thing is when we're getting rid of aliasing, we have to apply filters. And the type of filtering solution you pick and the characteristics that you give it are going to change how it shapes the sound in inaudible ways. So in the same way that some material that's inaudible might affect you later down the line if you don't oversample and fix some aliasing problems, if there's if there's oversampling implemented and it may cause problems in some situations that you didn't have before. So if you don't need it, it would be better to not have it on. There's one of these that crops up that's more obvious, is that if you have somebody that has chosen to have a shallow rather than a steep oversampling filter. This might be due to several reasons. Maybe this person is really concerned with, this developer or this tool is really concerned with latency, or they pick a certain type of filter where the processing power gets really, really high once they pick a very tight brick wall filter and they wanted to make it more efficient. I don't know, there's lots of decisions they can make. You're gonna start to hear a high frequency roll off if you have a bunch of plugins that all made this same decision. Now you can't know, the developers aren't gonna tell you, I use this algorithm for my oversampling or this filter characteristic, and they never allow you to select that. They only allow you to select the oversampling factor because it's just so much stuff. It's 2, 4, 8, 16, that's what you get. It's not, I want a brick wall versus a shallow filter, or I want to use infinite impulse response filter versus a finite impulse response filter. And if it's finite, it's not, I want equal ripple versus the sum of least square, like, so, it goes crazy.
It's better that they're only giving us a choice like only one time, 2 times, 4 times.
But you have another problem, which is that each of these developers may have picked a different solution. So they may have optimized for one thing, and then the next plug in your chain may have optimized for another. They're not talking to each other. And I made myself a little utility where I stacked a bunch of, I can stack oversampling solutions with no processing. One is so that I can pick the best solutions for what I decide to make. But two, I was just curious, if I do this, then that, then this, then that, what happens to the signal? It's not necessarily that bad. I would say that it's hard to hear unless you're really listening in the high ends. Again, that's where you talked about the aliasing, but the problems will be different. The problems will be due to phasing because it's the choices that are made with these filters, right? And with filters, when you pick minimum versus linear phase and like all these decisions, you're like stacking all of these low pass filters that are up there. But here's the biggest surprise to me, because I didn't even think about this as a problem. The number one most obvious thing that happens when you oversample and do nothing else, you can reduce your headroom. This is really obvious on something like a square wave. If you throw a square wave through it, now this, obviously I'm not saying we're all sitting here making music that's only like a Nintendo bass, but if you pass a square wave through nothing but oversampling and you try a bunch of different oversampling solutions, the square wave will look very different. It will sound very similar. If you really listen for it, you'll hear them in different things and depending on what you do. But the main point is when you put a filter on it, the whole job of the filter is to remove high frequency content from the signal. And making a sharp corner in a signal requires you to have a lot of high frequency
it's basically an unlimited amount of, you need an unlimited bandwidth in order to represent such a filter.
Exactly. Yeah. So when you remove that content, you have to change the shape of the waveform. And when you change the shape of the waveform and remove the high frequencies and smooth it out, we get something that's known as the Gibbs effect or the Gibbs phenomenon. And so if you throw a square wave in, oversample it, do nothing, and look at it, you're going to see ripples. And those ripples are going to be at right where there are those big sharp turns on the waveform. Yeah. And those ripples also tell you a lot about the filter that was used in the oversampling. If the ripples are only on one side, that means that they were using an infinite impulse response filter. And it also means the ripples will have a higher maximum ripple. That's just how it works. So an infinite impulse response filter will give you better latency characteristics, but you're going to have higher what we call undershoot or overshoot when the little ripple shoots above the top of the square and below the bottom of the square initially. And that's something that happens. And not only that, but the type of filter design on top of it, how steep the brick wall is, the steeper you make that brick wall, the higher the overshoot will be and eat up more of your headroom, even if it doesn't sound different to you, right? Yeah. So I have some popular oversampling libraries in here. So Juice, this is the one that ships with Juice. It didn't used to have one, it has one now. HIIR, I can't remember, I think the guy's name is like Laurent. So he has a solution he made a long time ago. There's this thing called polyphase filters that are really mathematically efficient and have exactly the right characteristics for an oversampler, and he did a great job implementing them. And then I have R8 Brain, which is some other one. But these are some ones that come up when I looked at this literature, so I just threw them all into this tool, and I was like, well, what happens when we throw stuff at them? We have our oscilloscope right here. We'll start with 2 times oversampling just because. And we're not listening right now, we're just looking. And again, the way that it looks does not represent the way that it hears, but it may have other things with the signal that it causes. So if I throw on a polyphase filter, we could just see immediately how much overshoot there is that happens on the signal. And that is going to cause whatever's listening to the signal to react differently, especially if you have dynamics processing on it. The good news is this isn't something I think that you're going to hear, at least immediately, unless you stack these. But if you do stack them, well, we'll throw another one of these on there and we'll just grab I don't know, maybe someone used Juice, and then, I don't know, maybe someone used R8 Brain, probably not, because it's very, very latent, has high latency, and we'll throw this on, and now there's a lot going on here on the edges of this wave. However, if I just take this guy here and I solo him, look at the difference.
Oh, wow, yeah.
Right, and there's 2 things to note here. One is that this is evenly on the left and right side of the edges because it's a finite impulse response filter. It's like it has an impulse response, like a convolution, we would do the same thing. But also it's specifically designed to deal with these kinds of problems. So if I can deal with having a massive latency,
oh wow,
this is probably, this latency reading is wrong. It's something I haven't fixed yet, but I think it's about half that. I think it's still 2,000 samples. But there's a huge sacrifice that's made. If I take this guy over here, this is 6 samples. Anyone can deal with that for the most part. 6 samples is like nothing. And then if we go back to this guy, 8,000. 4,000 is probably more accurate. But that's just to prove that we can see a trade-off right there. One more thing. This is a test signal. No real music except for, is gonna look like that. That's one. But it does crop up in real material. I've put real material through it. And just depending on your material, some of it you'll just have new peaks that you did not have. And up to 2 or 3 dB, I've seen them, sometimes higher for extreme situations. And if you stack multiple plugins and they're all using different IIR filters, infinite impulse, I'm gonna stop saying that, different minimum phase filters, it's gonna do stuff that you cannot predict and that was not intentional. So it is important, I think personally, to especially, you know me, I've been researching a lot about loudness lately too. You don't want your true peak limiter to start overreacting to stuff. You don't want to have these new peaks show up that you don't want to have to deal with. That being said, these peaks from an auditory standpoint, from a listening standpoint, they matter less when you listen than it looks. They look very different. They do not sound nearly as different as they look, which is a wild thing the first time you encounter it. But anyway, that's, in my opinion, that's a thing to look out for. People complain all the time about true peak limiters. They feel like it deadens their sound or whatever. One of the reasons may be that it's reacting to some of these things a little bit more strongly than it would need to if they weren't there. I don't know because I haven't done enough testing. I can just tell you that those overshoots you can see them immediately.
Okay, I have to break in here because does this make any sense in the real world? And I've been doing some real world testing here. The testing setup basically consists of a pop song, a very cool pop song, Sandstorm by the Root, which I'm limiting a little bit and aggressively limiting it a little bit because I want to overdo it. And honestly, I should have actually include some clipping or whatever in it, but I'm not the type of person that really likes to clip audio. Anyway, I'm really limiting my level at -3 dB true peak. And I then have a few different flavors of oversampling stacking. And then I have the Pro L that you can see over here, the big one, set at +3, so that we can see whenever we have overshoots. Because theoretically, if I now press play without any oversampling, and you can see this, we're peaking at exactly 0. Oh, you can see that we are already getting some overshoots. That's interesting. But just a little bit. And now when I enable the overcooker, with these algorithms stacked upon each other, you can see that we're getting a little bit more overshoots. Not a lot. And these are actually the lowest latency algorithms that I could stack on top of each other. However, I also made a toxic mix of oversampling algorithms. I've just been playing around until I got the most overshoot, basically. And here you can see that we're really getting some overshoots up to 0.4 of a decibel, 0.5 here. And this is a pretty taxing algorithm. So taxing that my Mac Mini actually doesn't like it. And if we compare this with an even more taxing algorithm, which all involves finite impulse responses, we'll see that we don't have those overshoots. Now in this situation, I'm getting half a decibel of overshoot. But again, if you're limiting harder, if you are clipping somewhere in your signal path, which basically means that there are samples in your audio that comply with the band limiting requirement, these overshoots can be even bigger. And the problem here is that your limiter will just respond differently. Definitely when you think about the fact that these peaks are inaudible. Like, I can't even hear them over here. And probably the YouTube codec is also not going to translate them. But they do change the processing down the line, and that's the point. So I wanna go back a little bit towards oversampling, because the biggest challenge in oversampling is filters. But what I want to know is, how do you actually oversample? Where do those extra samples come from?
Okay, we're going to get into sampling theory here. This is a lot. The standard method for oversampling, and there are many ways of doing this, is we do something that's called zero padding, which means that in between each sample, you insert another sample. And it's always zero. Okay, so now we've doubled our sample rate, but we've got a bunch of zeros in there. And in order to fill in the gaps, we pass it through a low pass filter, and that'll essentially turn it into a smooth, continuous signal, and that works.
Is that filter on the Nyquist of the old sample rate or on the new sample rate?
It would be the Nyquist of the old sample rate.
Okay.
So you want to get rid of all of the frequencies that might have cropped up in your processing that are above Nyquist. And so the decisions are all about how steep is that filter, where exactly do you put it, things like that. What are its characteristics? That filter will fill in all the zero patterned samples, and then you can repeat the process in multiple stages to go 2, 4, 8, 16, which is why those are the most common things that you see. And that's the most typical way to oversample. There's another way which more directly uses interpolation. So sampling theory comes from, what's it called, the Nyquist-Shannon sampling theory, or Nyquist-Shannon-Whittaker. The Whittaker gets in there. I mean, all three of these people were involved in the mathematical theories that allowed us to do this. And basically the theory says that if we have a band-limited signal, a signal whose no frequencies, if we do a mathematical breakdown, that are in that signal are above the Nyquist of a sampling rate that we're going to use to sample it, then we can represent it as samples and then re-extract that waveform perfectly, which is surprising. We always think, oh, we must lose something. But if we use perfect math that we can do with a pen and paper, we can get back the perfect signal. Unfortunately, we can't use perfect math because that would require infinite computing power, so there's something lost. We just try to make sure that it's as little as possible, right? So another way we could do this is called windowed sync interpolation. People may have seen this in everything from oversampling to just resampling, when you want to just shift something up or down by resampling it, like in a sampler or something like that. And windowed sync is essentially saying what the Nyquist-Shannon theory says is if we have samples, and instead of representing them as one dot here, one dot there, one dot there, we think of the dot as the center of what's called a sync function. Looks like, if you've seen it, it's one of those things that has like little wiggles and then like a big thing and then a bunch of little wiggles. Right? That's what a sync function looks like, right? So if we represent each sample as an entire sync function, kind of scaled and shifted by time, and sum them all together, we will have, as long as we don't have any frequencies above Nyquist, we will be able to perfectly reconstruct whatever signal went in. And so that means we can interpolate perfectly. Now the problem with this is that the sync function goes forever, literally forever backwards and forwards in time. So we can't do it because we can't stack sync functions, because it would require us to do an infinite number of calculations. Hence the word window. So we do a windowed sync and say like, okay, so we'll have like ba 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 ba. We'll go about that far, and then they'll multiply it by a window, usually a Hahn window. These are windowing functions. It's a whole other area of DSP. And then they'll be like, okay, now we have a finite number of samples multiplied by some window so that we don't have these sharp cutoffs and the sync function just stops. Now we can have a very, very, very close to perfect thing, and we will oversample by doing the signal from that. But our 8-brains technique is a hybrid of those. It oversamples times 2, and then from that point on, it does a windowed sync. But there are probably lots of other proprietary oversampling methods that aren't open source. Those are all open source ones that could do God knows what, any kind of interpolation or whatever. But whatever they're doing, it's trying to, as close as possible, perfectly recreate what would happen if we had these sync functions that lasted forever. It would be a perfect brick wall filter. It would have none of these problems. It's just that, again, it would require infinite compute power. So everything is just, if only we had an infinite computer, but we don't, and we never will. So
and the other way around, because, and this is, I think, a thing where a lot of audio engineers get scared. Downsampling. Is that just simply... Is it simply just deleting a half of the samples, or like a certain amount of samples, or is it more complicated than that?
Basically, yeah. First, you Well, first you have to filter again, and then you can delete the sample. Or you can use windowed sync again. Because that will always give you a perfect like theoretically, if you had a perfect, so if you're approximating that, then whatever the downsides of your approximation are, based on whatever math you did, you're still like, all right, now I can pick wherever I want on the curve. If you did the stage version where you're like zero pad, low pass, et cetera, you essentially do the same thing on the way back down, where you'd be like, all right, we'll have a filter and then we'll remove half the samples and another one. But people go about this all ways. They've found tricks to like mash these stages together or pad it with 8 samples and just do one filter. There's lots of decisions that can make it more efficient or like whatever. Again, it's part of that trade-off, latency, quality, and there's also the filter characteristics, but
yeah, again, I mean, that's what this whole thing started with. What you're basically saying is like, if you have and correct me if I'm wrong, but if you have a single plugin that needs oversampling, it's okay to use the oversampling from that plugin. But as soon as you're going to stack them up, it might be, and Reaper has a function for this, it's called chain oversampling. It might be better to just oversample the whole chain.
Oh yeah, I think that's a great feature. I want to see more sequencers have that feature, and I want to see more people understand what it does for them. But one oversampler can still cause that overshoot problem, even just one. So you also want to take a look. You can always pass your square through and see like, do I need to care about whether or not this is causing these overshoots or not?
Definitely if you have like your last limiter in the chain and then it's going to sample down, like it should actually sample down and then input into the last limiter, because if there's an overshoot, that last limiter would catch it.
That's true, but also, yeah, exactly. But the other problem is that you don't want it to overreact to it. So it's like, what am I going to do?
Like, yeah, exactly.
It's like a nightmare.
Yeah, but if you need
it's just sort of a chicken and egg problem where you're like, it'll overreact, but then I don't want the true peak, and then
but for engineers it's always a creative problem. So they usually just compare between the two and just like, hey, this one sounds the best, done. Like that's how audio engineers usually work.
That's how you should do it. Yeah, listening is always the best move.
And I mean. But this is all like, again, there's never a simple answer to things like this.
I wish.
Yeah, and
there's one other option if your sequencer doesn't have it, and that's simply oversample your audio and then do your work in 192 or 176 or whatever.
That's what I just wanted to say, because...
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry I took that from you.
No.
Go ahead.
No. It's perfect. It's no problem. Isn't it the whole thing with running a studio in 96, running a studio in 192? Isn't this one of the things that actually makes a difference in sound? Like converters, I mean, I understand. I run my setup at 96K as well. Also because, the converters also have filters. And on 96, there's more room for that filter than on 48. And I've just noticed that the RMEs run the best on 96 kilohertz. But isn't this part of the reason why people prefer 96 or 192 to 48? Because from a conversion perspective, 48 should be enough. But from a processing perspective, higher sample rate can actually be beneficial.
Yeah, I agree with that. And for the most part, aliasing is why that matters so much. And I think that it's a tough battle to fight. We've been stuck at 41, 48. I mean, we seem to have gotten past the 16 to 24 for mixing so that we have more dynamics control doing that. But the sample rate has really stayed fairly low. I think part of it is just because of the compute power, but it benefits everybody if we can get higher sampling rates. Then your plugins don't have to oversample. In my personal experience, and I don't want everyone to say that this is a hard rule because it's not a hard rule. The most bang for the buck I've gotten is usually at four times oversampling, like 2 to 4, which would be like 176 or 192, depending on if you're in broadcast or music. And so if you run your sessions at that and all your waveforms are running at that, then your plugins don't have to oversample. And this does not become a problem for developers of plugins, except for those that are doing the kind of final output stages. And then you as a user also don't have to think about it as much. Still want to do listening tests, but that's kind of a big workflow win. It's a lot of processing power. So that's part of why.
But from also a mathematical perspective, it's also the smoothest way of doing it. Just, run the whole session in a high sample rate and then all the way at the end, bring it back to the low sample rate. That's
yeah, I mean, up, down, up, down, up, down.
It's a bit like rescaling a photograph a lot of times. Like, sizing it up, sizing it down, sizing it up, sizing it down. It's going to lose quality in one way or another.
So there's one thing about that, and I gotta give you this utility, but the very surprising thing to me is that even when I did this a lot on one channel, and I picked 4 different oversampling engines with totally different settings, it was, other than the headroom overshoot, it was pretty hard to hear it massively messing with the signal. I think that the most obvious one is if I stacked ones that had a gentle filter, I could start to hear a roll off because they picked a very conservative level. But it's mostly going to be in if you have minimum phase ones that are like in that phasing, and that even that is going to be pushed way high up in the spectrum. So I think it's fair to say that it's a little bit better than the situation with an image. It doesn't, at least to my ears, seem to get as blurry. But I want to listen to lots of like cymbals and percussive noises and stuff like that, stacking 4 or 8 of these things. Luckily, it's not horrendous, but anyway, it's there.
Are there any alternative solutions to oversampling?
Well, one of them are the 2 we just talked about. It's oversample all your tracks and work in 192 or 176. The other is if you have the same feature as Reaper and it's stable and works well for you, you can do that. But then the plugins you use, you have to make sure you can turn oversampling off because you don't want it running at like an insane rate.
If there's no option in there, if
this is yeah.
on by default. So what I'm saying in my videos, it should be on by default, is actually kind of wrong to say. Like,
well, I had the same. Yeah, my business partner's going to kill me for this, but this is in our product too. Yeah. Like I'm like the number one thing I realized is like, oh crap, I have to have a way to turn it off for people that run it off. I'm about to recommend in this paper I wrote that everyone do something that my plugin doesn't let them do.
Can't the plugin detect it?
It can. It can definitely detect it, and I think that those are the things that are going through my head right now. Is instead of saying 2, 4, 6, 8, do I just say low, medium, high, and then it reacts to what the sample rate is coming in, and low, medium, high are more about not the factor, but at what the processing rate is. Like high means I should be processing at whatever 300 and something kilohertz, and then whatever I need to do to get there by doubling the sample rate, I'll do. And I think that to me might be the approach that I take. I'll just give that away. But I don't know. I'm still running through all of these things and deciding where we're going to go with it. And then when I do it, the users are going to say one thing or another, and whatever they say is going to be best for their workflow. I'm going to change it because I've got to make sure it works for people. So we'll see. This is going to be the other ways are depending on the process, right? So in the very beginning, I said oversampling is so great because it's general. It will solve any aliasing problem that you have. There are also specific anti-aliasing methods, and these are methods where we know the math that we're going to do, and so we can change that math so that the thing that comes out of the math is already band limited. And there are some examples of this that are in like analog emulation. So you might not need oversampling if the analog emulation makes the math linear processing that still does the right thing. In synthesis, we'll see like blep, blit, polyblep, mini blip, mipmaps, like all these other things. All those boil down to they did some math that will band limit the signal as they're calculating it, which does the work so you don't have to oversample, which is a general method, right? And essentially it's just making the math come out right. There's a really great technique that came out of academia more recently from Stanford's Karma program, and I use it a bit, some other plugin developers use it, I don't know, and it's called antiderivative anti-aliasing, or ADAA. And if you know the math that you're going to perform that's nonlinear, you can do some additional stuff to your own math that will cut down on the aliasing that comes back. And you can do this in more levels. It's just that the more you do it, it's more computationally expensive, and also you start to have little holes in the math where you might have a divide by 0 and then da-da-da-da-da. But combining that with oversampling can yield really good results with less oversampling and stuff like that. But again, it's specific to the math that's involved with the processing. So if I'm developing a plugin and I want to have high quality, and I don't have a mathematician on hand, it might be faster for me to do oversampling because I can just do whatever process I was doing, oversample, be fine. But if I have the time to do the math right, I can implement antiderivative anti-aliasing for my process if it's possible, and that comes into my plugin. This is a technique that's been published. There's open source software for it. There's a guy, I'm going to mispronounce his name, but Jatin, I think, Chowdhury. Huh?
Oh,
Jayton?
Chowdhury.
Chowdhury, yeah.
Chowdhury.
He did Chow Tape. He's great because he publishes and shares all of this stuff that he comes up with, and so we as a community benefit because we can take this math from the academy and from theory, and we can put it into good use. And he's like a, you know, that's part of what he's done. And so that's another cool technique. And it has varying degrees of success. If you look at it and look at the audio developers and forums talking about it, they all have their own opinions about when it works and when it doesn't. But it's a technique. It's known about. Who knows if people will market with it? I don't know. So,
Yeah. I mean, yeah. That's another thing. Interesting. By the way, just you know, off the record, I just reviewed a plugin that was based up on Chowtape. It's a different one. It has just been released, and I'm comparing it with the real deal tape machine, and it's completely losing it over the real tape. So,
no.
so I think I will have Jayton soon in my inbox shouting to me.
and that's fine. I think one of the really interesting things about audio is it's like so many other things where like there's the pure math. But that'll only get us so far. And like our reality has so many dents and divots and whatever that the pure stuff will get us the theory of how it works. But just like you can't use pure music theory to make a great song, you can't use pure math to make great sound. And it's like it's that magic in between that really gets us going. So that's cool. Yeah.
Wow, that's really that's a really cool. Basically, cool way to end this interview, because I think that's a very nice quote. All right, so we learned a lot today about, well, filtering, because it turns out that's a very important part of oversampling. But we didn't talk about everything yet. For instance, we haven't talked about things like ringing. So there's still way more to it. And the age-old saying of the more you know, the more you don't know is really applying here as well. So to sum up as a conclusion, do you need to oversample? Well, no, if you're only using linear processing. Probably not, or maybe if your session is already in a high sample rate and you're using nonlinear processing. And if you're on a low sample rate and you're using nonlinear processing, then yes. And if you're running multiple plugins, you might want to take a look into chain oversampling instead of independent oversampling. That's basically the conclusion of this video. So with that said, thanks a lot for watching this video. If you want to support me, check out my affiliate links over here and down there. When purchasing something through my affiliate link, a little bit of your purchase gets kicked back to me. I'll also link some interesting links in the description down below about oversampling, the papers and that kind of stuff. Another way to support me is by becoming a channel member. You can do that by pressing the join button down below, and if it's not there, you have to go to the YouTube website. As a member, you get early access to videos and access to some exclusive content. I'll link an interesting playlist over here. Last way to support me is by just watching more videos. I'll link an interesting video over here. Thanks a lot for watching, keep pushing, and bye bye.